Okay, good afternoon everybody. Welcome back. Thank you for coming back in promptly. Okay, so we have two excellent speakers, just to set them up nicely for the plenary session now. So first of all, I'm delighted to welcome Norman Lamb, who has been Liberal Democrat MP for North Norfolk since 2001. You will remember he was Minister of State for Care and Support in the coalition government from 2012 to 2015, and has remained, was then and has remained very engaged with issues in the social care area. He is, among many other things, chair of the Science and Technology Select Committee, which is looking at a number of things, including early intervention, I think. But certainly very engaged. So I'm very pleased that we have Norman with us today. So let me welcome him up here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. This is my second speech of the day. So I was previously speaking on research integrity. So if you see me drifting off the script onto a totally different subject, it's a failure of my brain. So I'll try and make sure I talk about social care. Very good to be here. The last time I was with Martin was in a riverside cafe in Melbourne about 4 weeks ago when the whole of the country was deep in snow. Martin's saying shush. I think he wants this not to be revealed, but it was a very enjoyable experience at the World Psychiatric Association conference. In my time as Minister, responsible for social care, along with mental health and a number of other things, we took the Care Act through Parliament. I think it's quite good legislation. I think it's been undermined by a failure to properly resource it. But I think the principles are the right principles as a sort of foundation stone for the legislation. But I wanted this afternoon to say something about the recent history of attempts to try and get this area of policy right, and then looking forward, what I think are the steps that we need to take. But before I embark on that, I just wanted to sort of pose the question, what are we seeking to achieve here? And for me, I think the way in which social care often operates, and I suppose also linked to the way in which the NHS operates, can still be in quite a paternalistic approach. I think particularly in later life and at end of life, there is a culture which is too often risk averse. There is a culture which restricts what people can do. Someone was commentating recently that we give more freedom to children than we do sometimes to older people, all to avoid any risk that something might go wrong, but losing sight of what this actually should be about, which surely is about giving people a good life. And for those of you who haven't read it, I would recommend to you Atul Gawande's Being Mortal, because I think it's, although it's written from the perspective of a surgeon actually working in the United States, I think the analysis is universal, and I think that the culture that he points to, a culture which in a sense is all about sustaining life, almost irrespective of the quality of that life, is one that we should, I think, all reflect on. There was a guy, a GP called Dr. Gavin Francis, who did a review of the book, and he said, "We have exalted longevity over what makes life worth living." And I think that in a way sums up the problem. And for me, what we all ought to be focused on is happiness. What makes life worth living? And in part, that is about giving power and control to people. And I will come back to that a little later on. But I think in many respects we're still failing to meet the test of ensuring that the system works for people. So then a word about the history of this. Well, go back to the early years of the Blair government. Blair elected in 1997. He made good on his promise to establish a Royal Commission to look at the funding of social care. It reported in 1999. And it said it is too complex and provides no clarity as to what people can expect. Well, we could say exactly the same thing now. We have made, in many respects, little progress in confronting this problem. The membership of the Royal Commission was divided. There was a minority report, and essentially nothing happened as a result of it. 6 years later, there was another green paper. Nothing really much came from that. Then in 2009-10, there was a lot of talk from Andy Burnham about a national care service. There was talk about reform of the funding and entitlements in social care. And in the run-up to the general election, I actually took the initiative of trying to bring together Andy Burnham, Andrew Lansley and myself, the three health spokespersons, including the Secretary of State, to try to see whether we could agree some principles about how the system needed to be reformed. And we actually got the three of us into a room together. We discussed the value in trying to agree principles. It was agreed that I would draw up a set of principles after having input from both of them. I got quite a lengthy contribution from Andrew Lansley. I got a text message from Andy Burnham. But together, bringing all of this together, I drew up a statement of principles which could then potentially inform a cross-party process to try to reach some conclusion here. But what happened then was that the Conservative Party launched, if you remember, their death tax campaign with a tombstone with death tax on it because of Andy Burnham's advocacy of a tax after death as a means of funding social care, and the whole thing was blown out of the water. So we were back to square one. Then, of course, with the advent of the coalition, we appointed Andrew Dilnot to advise government. He duly made his report. He recommended a cap on care costs. We consulted on that. There was a widespread consensus that that was the right way forward. No sense that this was a sort of golden bullet, but that it was the best of the options that were available. We legislated for that through the Care Act, not just the cap on care costs. It's fair to say that the cap we legislate, well, the cap we planned, it wasn't a figure set out in the Act, at 72,000 was significantly above the level that Andrew Dilnot had recommended. That was the best we could get out of George Osborne. And the view I took was establish the principle, get it into legislation, and then you could have a political debate about the level of the cap after that. But we legislated, and that included also a plan for an extended means test up to 118,000 to ensure that before you ever got to the cap, there was a fairer contribution towards care costs. After the 2015 election, there was an announcement this was all going to be delayed until 2020. I suspected at the time that that was a means of effectively abandoning it, and it's what I said at the time, but they insisted that it was only delayed until 2020. It was subsequently abandoned. And then, of course, we had the announcement halfway through the general election in the Conservative manifesto. And in a sense, this encapsulates the problem of trying to sort this out on a partisan basis, because the proposal from the Conservatives, flawed though it was in my view, because it did nothing to pool risk at all, it was at least audacious, and it was at least seeking to find a mechanism to get more money into the system with people with money in older age making a contribution. But they were blown out of the water for making that recommendation. And actually, I probably owe my seat to that announcement, because it was palpable on the streets in North Norfolk, a very elderly community. Immediately, people rebelled against the Conservative message and shifted voting intentions as a result of that. But in a way, it was the perfect demonstration that we will not solve this problem on a partisan basis, and I'll come back to that. So that's where we're at today. What's happening in terms of trends? Well, there's a dramatic demographic shift that you are all acutely aware of. 600,000 people over the age of 85 in 1982. By 32, it will be 3.1 million. A dramatic ageing of the population. In just a 10-year period that we're within at the moment, I think it's the 10 years up to 2019, an increase of more than 50% in the number of people living with 3 or more chronic conditions. This is an extraordinary increase of pressure on the system. And very often it's a mix of physical and mental health conditions. They are the most expensive of all those patients, and they're the ones who are most let down by the system. But this is a dramatic increase in pressure on the system. And more than 50% of people over the age of 75 living alone. And this is, again, a dramatic change. If you think back a few decades to the extended family all living in the same village or living on the same street, supporting each other. And of course, now the extended family is dispersed far and wide. My own family is a good example of that. And inadvertently, we've left older people completely stranded, often, with no one supporting them. And in my family's experience, my mother, who died 3 years ago, she happened to have a fantastic network of neighbours who supported her, but very many people don't have that. And they are literally isolated, seeing no one from day to day. The only experience they have is of a formal care worker coming in to wash, to bathe, to feed, and returning in the evening if they are lucky. That's the only human contact many people have. And that's not a life that's worth living, it seems to me. It's not a life that I would particularly want, but it's the experience of very many older people. Also, it's worth noting an extraordinary divide on healthy life expectancy. So if you look at healthy life expectancy, the number of years that we expect to have in good health at the age of 65, a dramatic difference from the poorest communities to the wealthiest. So take Tower Hamlets. At the age of 65, healthy life expectancy there is 6.5 years. Just a few miles down the road in Richmond, it's, I think, 14.5 years. A dramatic difference based on social class. And it seems to me that that is unacceptable, and it ought to be a focus of public policy. It's also worth noting that our ability to fund public services, quite apart from any debate about austerity, does just get more and more difficult. The ratio of people of working age who are working and paying taxes to people in retirement gets more and more challenging. So in 2016, for every 1,000 people of working age, there were 305 people in retirement. But by 2041, 305 will have gone up to 370. So the pressure on people of working age to fund this through their taxes just gets more and more challenging. And it's also worth remembering that it's not just older people. We have now got to the point where I think just over 50% of the budget is spent on people of working age who have profound disabilities. This is learning disabilities, it's autism, it's a whole mix of physical disabilities. And the cost of the care packages are often enormous. And these are people who in the past would not have survived their disabilities in many cases. And it's a triumph of man and woman's ingenuity that people now survive. but there is a cost attached to ensuring that we behave in a civilised way as a society, and we haven't yet worked out a way, it seems to me, of doing that. And then there is the point about the cut of funding to what I would call the preventive end of the spectrum. And it started actually before the 2010 election, but it absolutely carried on through the coalition. Irrational, actually, the decisions in Treasury about where the cuts would fall. The NHS protected in real terms with marginal increases year on year, but the reduction, real terms reduction in funding of social care from 2009-10 is 8%. Now that is a significant cut to the preventive services that stop people having to rely on the NHS when things go wrong. So that, it seems to me, is irrational. And we now have 1.2 million older people, it's estimated, who are not having their care needs met. So the system is now under impossible strain. We have awful consequences to this. Just one little example, I have a couple in North Norfolk who've been married for many, many years, I think decades. They went through 6 months of being forcibly separated last year because they couldn't organise a care package, the county council couldn't organise a care package to allow the wife to return home from a care home. Enormous costs incurred by the couple in the care home, but worst of all, the husband was desperate to care for his wife, but they were forcibly separated, many miles apart, for a long time, at a very important time of their lives, and that is unacceptable. We have providers withdrawing from the publicly funded market. We have no investment in the poorer parts of the country where you can't cross-subsidise. In many care homes, they only work because the private payers are cross-subsidising the publicly funded payers. So where you don't have the mix of public and private, in many parts of the north, there is simply no new investment going into new care facilities, which means that we're going to see an ever-increasing divide across the country. King's Fund, Nuffield Trust, Health Foundation estimated by the end of the decade, the funding gap will be £2.5 billion. So what's needed? What should be the priorities to get this, I think, significant failure of public policy sorted out? Well, the first thing I would say is that we will not resolve this on a partisan basis. We saw what happened in the general election campaign. We saw what happened when Andy Burnham talked about a death tax. The other parties will always condemn anyone who seeks to be audacious, seeks to come up with solutions. This is difficult. It involves more public spending. There are really complex issues about intergenerational fairness, the question of whether wealthier older people should be paying more. Wealthy older people vote. Which political party is going to go out and advocate that they should be paying more? So nothing happens, and we have a conspiracy of silence, which is massively letting down people in this country. And so we have to, in my view, establish a process that gives politicians the space to come up with the basis of a new settlement. Now, today, we've had published a letter from 98 MPs calling on the Prime Minister to establish a parliamentary commission in the form of the Banking Commission, which was established in the early years of the coalition after the LIBOR scandal. That worked as a mechanism, and so we have to be willing to do the same, it seems to me, again. As we approach the 70th birthday of the NHS, what better time to actually start to confront this public policy failure? Secondly, I think we need to look at the case for a hypothecated NHS and care tax. I would base it on national insurance, a reformed national insurance. National insurance as it stands now is not sufficiently progressive, so it would need to be reformed to ensure that it was absolutely based on ability to pay across the age range. but it also has to be fair between the generations. Again, that means that national insurance would need significant reform so that people in retirement on unearned income and people beyond the age of 65 who continue to work would be contributing to the NHS and care tax. But there are other things that we need to confront. For example, I've recently turned 60. I found it a traumatic moment, but it was slightly eased by the fact that I'm now ridiculously entitled to free prescriptions. Is that not completely ridiculous? I earn $75,000 as an MP. I earn a bit more as chair of a select committee. Someone on the minimum wage in their 20s is not entitled to free prescriptions. Why should I be entitled to it? I travelled here from Parliament using my Freedom Pass. That's outrageous. So we can reprioritise where public money is spent to meet the important priorities. Third, we need to end, in my view, the divide between the NHS and the social care system. To anyone who has need for support for their care needs and for their health needs, they don't make a distinction between the two. They simply recognise a failure of the system to join up the care to meet their needs. They are pushed from pillar to post. They are faced with arguments about funding between the two sides of the divide because both sides are under such significant pressure. They argue with each other about who is to fund care in any particular case. We have the nightmare of NHS continuing care, which sits on that border between a free system and a means-tested system. And it's a system under impossible pressure. And we know that lots of people are having their entitlement reviewed, not on the basis of need, but on the basis of trying to restrict cost of that system. So we need to bring the NHS and the care system together. A pooled budget in localities is my view about how it should be done. I think it's worth exploring what we could do to learn the lessons from Greater Manchester, where they have devolved responsibility for the NHS and the care budget. I think we could create incentives for local areas to benefit from wise and effective use of resources with a unified budget, with aligned incentives across the whole system, aligned incentives to keep people well, to stop the deterioration of health, rather than at the moment only incentivising activity in acute hospitals, which is the way in which the system works, ludicrous as it is. Fourth, we need to, in my view, return to the Dil-Not cap. It's not perfect, but it starts to reduce the divide between a free system and a means-tested system. We've gone through a process of legislating for it, delaying it, abandoning it. Now, yesterday, last week, Jeremy Hunt talked about returning to the idea of a cap. We have no detail of that, but we appear to be going full circle, but that seems to me to be part of the framework of a better functioning system. Fifth, I think there is enormous opportunities with this burgeoning quantity of data within the NHS and the care system, and the potential for technology to help keep people independent. Wearables. Many of us in this room will be wearing these devices that can monitor all sorts of things. But we don't have the incentives in the system to get providers to make the investment up front in the technological solutions which can keep people independent in their own homes. So we need to be prepared to get the incentives right and to invest up front in the technology. Sixth, technology alone does not do it. Humanity has to be part of the solution. If the extended family has been dispersed far and wide, something else needs to replace it. And that seems to me to be the local community, neighbours, friends, and we all, it seems to me, have to step up to the plate here. We all know that on our streets where we live, there are people who live alone, who are isolated and who often see no one. Are we doing enough as communities to support those people? And it seems to me that this is not something that government can impose, but it's something that I think we need to confront culturally in terms of how we give people a better life. Seventh and penultimate, housing. There is an extraordinary market failure with housing. The housing stock is completely inadequate for the needs of people with disability, people in old age. We have failed so far to address that market failure, but that again needs to be part of the solution. And then finally, and I return to what I said at the start, thinking about what we're trying to achieve here: happiness, well-being, control, and power to lead our lives as we choose to lead our lives, rather than what the state thinks is appropriate for us. So the whole development of personal budgets, of direct payments, needs, in my view, to be reinvigorated. There is, in my view, a worrying loss of momentum in many councils. We legislated to embed personal budgets in legislation in the 2014 Care Act, but too often it's a paper exercise, a personal budget that gives the appearance of the person having control, but in reality the bureaucracy, the administration is actually making all of the decisions. We need to develop a network of intermediaries, of social enterprises in local communities, which can act as employer where necessary for people who aren't able to do that themselves, but to ensure that the money is retained in a locality and is used for people's benefit. And we need to explore how wonderful things like Shared Lives Plus, which many of you will be familiar with, an organisation where people with disability, people with learning disability, with mental ill health and so forth, live with families rather than in institutions. And very often the outcome of this approach, which has developed far more in some part of the country than in others, the outcome is a lower cost to the state, but a massively enhanced life for the individual concerned. And so I think our whole emphasis needs to never forget the importance of what this is about. And it is about trying to give people the chance of a happy life. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Norman. So we have a few minutes for questions or comments. Raise your hands. Okay. Is there a second one here on this side? Just can we get ready? If anybody's got a question, just let me know.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a position within the PSSRU here, and I'm also a past carer for my mother and husband, Margaret Dangour. I just want to raise the point, because I'm very interested in this, you know, how the future funding is going to be taken forward. Just raise the point that actually self-funders are making a tremendous contribution already. My husband's care at home cost about 120,000 self-funded before continuing care at the very end of his life. My mother's about 400,000 in a nursing home. That was a few years ago. So what I'm saying is that I'm looking at the money that we're already spending and subsidising care homes and how that will balance with any contribution we make through national insurance, etc., any model that comes out of the, comes out at the end of the day, how that financial sort of balance will work, you know, positives and negatives really, because with movement of the money into the state system, there is, you know, we are actually taking on a huge level of responsibility as funders. all over the country, some in more areas than others. So I'm just raising that point because it has to be taken into consideration.
Well, I agree. And I mentioned in what I said that there is, I think, an unacceptable cross-subsidy in care homes. Someone in, I can't remember which relative it was, your mother, £400,000. A proportion of that £400,000 will have covered the cost of other people in that care home who were receiving care via the local authority, if there was a mix of funding types in that care home. And I recognise completely that the solution to this has to involve people with resources in older age making a contribution. But I think in a way that's the attraction of the care cap, that it recognises that you upfront, you pay from your own resources if you have them. But there is a limit to that. There is a recognition that pooling of risk is a reasonable thing to try and do, even with people with money. I don't think as a society we should say simply because, for example, you happen to be in a position where you own a semi-detached house in Warsaw or wherever it might be, that means you should pay for everything if you're unlucky enough to end up with dementia, particularly when the millionaire in the leafier suburb a few miles away is getting their cancer care completely funded by the NHS. Now, what's the public policy justification for that total disparity of treatment of those two people? So I think in any solution, a recognition that people with resources will have to make a contribution and that it will be based on the scale of those resources. A reformed national insurance would involve contributions from older people, which they're not making, in my view, sufficiently at the moment. But it would also recognise that it's good public policy to protect people from catastrophic loss.
Okay. Yep.
And one at the back as well.
Okay.
Just pass.
Thank you, sir. And then Shireen will go next to you. Okay.
Hi, my name's Rachel Feiston from the University of Nottingham. I just wanted to pick your brain a bit more about this notion of the care cap, because from a kind of an equity perspective, I would agree with that argument. But in terms of the practicalities of implementing it, I think there are some really serious flaws. Because if we're looking at the care cap, we're looking at capped costs of needs which are assessed as eligible. Therefore, the amount of social work input you're going to need to assess anybody's needs in order to be, for their things that they pay for themselves to be then registered as contributing towards that care cap. It's such a complex system and will cost so much to administer that it actually leads me to think that we would be better having something like the death tax, because it's a simple, straightforward way of doing it, whereas the cap on care cost is immensely problematic in terms of administration. I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that, really.
Yeah, so first of all, it's a legitimate point. I completely accept that, and I have an open mind about this. On balance, my view is that there are good reasons to go for the care cap, and I'll come on to those in a moment. But the reason why I advocate a sort of cross-party process is to genuinely allow different ideas to be put into the mix, and for us consensus to attempt to build a consensus for one or other solution. I think the death tax concept is absolutely one that we should consider, and it has the benefit of simplicity. The point I wanted to make about the care cap and the complexity is a genuine problem. The potential benefit is that it encourages people to engage. Now, you could just regard it as a gatekeeping exercise, but alternatively, if you design services in a more constructive way, you could potentially take advantage of the fact that people are making contact with the local authority to guide them into how to best manage their care needs and to engage, to link them up with the sort of services and community groups that can help and so forth. And so I think, and this is a point that Andrew Dilnot made in his argument in favour of the cap, that it could create a mechanism for engagement which could help to prevent the deterioration in the first place. But I take on board completely the concern that it could be overly complex.
Okay, thank you. So we've got Shireen, I think, was next.
And then the chap there.
Yeah, so you can
there's one up.
keep coming down. Put your hand up, Shireen, so he can see. That's fine.
There's one up in the top there.
Okay, so can we make these quick questions and quick responses, and then we'll fit three in.
Well, Shireen Hussain from King's College London. First, thank you very much for the historical overview because it put things in context. But you did mention that a lot of the cuts were quite irrational. And I think now we're always thinking how to fund social care, but there is a question of what the state funding should be and how that could be protected. And also you touched on the issue of inequality, which is a very, very important issue at old age. And from your perspective, what could be policies to encourage that? And while you talked about...
You mean on the inequality of healthy life
exactly,
expectancy?
of the inequalities of older people, and how that is in the light of the 8% cut in the preventative kind of work, which actually would address that sort of thing. So it's really from a policy perspective, what can be done to address these issues? How can you protect first the social care? And then, because I'm greedy, I want to know what the research, briefly, what's the research questions that we want to trigger to help the policy development of these things? Thank you.
Well, I think, first of all, a word for Martin here. When I first came across Martin, I was it was my first couple of months as minister, and I went to the Association of Directors of Adult and Children's Social Care conference, and Martin was giving a talk, and I just went and sat in the audience and listened to him, and he was talking about public mental health, and this is on your research point, because there is a growing body of evidence about interventions on a public health basis that offer a return on investment, that are effective and good use of public money. And I think we need to do more to build up the knowledge and understanding of what we can do to stop deterioration of health in the first place. Secondly, part of this has to be about recognising the social determinants of health, and part of that is about disadvantage and poverty. Just think about Tower Hamlets and Richmond, the contrast between the two. And if we are to confront the awful inequalities of health outcomes in our country, the solutions lie way outside the NHS and the care system. This is about disadvantage and inequality in our society, which, in my view, we have to seek to confront. And I can't remember what the third point was you raised, but I hope I've given you something to think about there.
Can we just have there's a lady there? Can you just make it quite a quick question, please? Then we'll have time for one more. Yes.
Anna McEwen, Shared Lives Plus Day. Thank you very much for your wonderful plug for Shared Lives.
Oh, right. I didn't know you were there.
We've got a number of Shared Lives people in the audience today,
Excellent.
so thank you. So how do you think we can ensure the scale and spread of community-based solutions like Shared Lives?
So I remember last year I chaired a commission on mental health in the West Midlands. We produced an action plan, Thrive West Midlands, at the end of it. It's become part of a global network of city and city regions that are focusing on big public mental health approaches to improve the health of the whole of the urban community. And I remember we looked at bidding for a small pot of money that Shared Lives Plus had secured from the government to pump prime a development of shared lives in the West Midlands. Now, the West Midlands wasn't successful in that bidding process. And despite Shared Lives not choosing the West Midlands, I still was nice about you. But I think we can use money, national money, to pump prime an exploration of this in my own county of Norfolk, where we face the most nightmarish cuts in our social care infrastructure. I've just written to the Director of Adult Social Care to say, engage with Shared Lives Plus, because if you really develop this as a county, we could reduce cost and have a big positive impact on people's lives. So I think, a combination of incentives from the national level and audacious local leadership could make a difference.
Okay, last comment.
I'm Ulati, Research Network volunteer at the Alzheimer's Society.
Excellent.
I am wondering whether it is time now to legislate that dementia care should be classified as a social and a health care. Because in the current form, even with the integrated care, social care, does not completely support the care services and the funding services for the dementia care.
Well, I don't know whether people heard the question, but it was about whether we should redesignate dementia in effect as a health need so that it could be entitled to support as with other conditions such as cancer within the NHS. And I touched on this disparity of approaches between cancer and dementia without any real justification for that different approach. And in a way, that's why I think the cap on care costs or something similar starts to reduce the divide. You could do the same through a death tax as a mechanism to reduce the individual cost of social care. But the bottom line is that we leave very many families completely abandoned with dementia. And I think part of the solution is about the money, but also part of it is about being smarter at how we support people and families with dementia. I remember visiting a primary care practice in Staffordshire, at Nosal in Staffordshire, where the GP, who was passionate about dementia care, had employed within the GP practice someone who could do the diagnoses in most cases. They didn't have to go off to a memory clinic and wait a long time. They could do the local diagnosis and then seamlessly provide continuing support within the community. And they had demonstrated that a much lower percentage of people with dementia ended up in a care home or a nursing home, supported much more effectively in their local community. And I think that's the sort of approach we need to be pursuing as well.
Okay, I have to draw this to a close. I'm going to thank you, Norman. Wonderful presentation. Lots of good information for us to take away, lots of things for us to think about. And as I said this morning, stir them into the things you're going to contribute to the Green Paper consultation on social care. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.